I went to collect my grandmother's photo albums, but my mother said, "It's just old junk." Then I saw the dumpster, my stepdad blocking the door, and my grandmother's life sitting in trash bags. So I handed her the eviction notice. I know how cold that sounds. I've replayed it enough times to know exactly how ugly it looks from the outside. A daughter giving her own mother 60 days to leave. But nobody starts with how they moved into my grandmother's house for a few weeks and slowly acted like it belonged to them. My grandmother, Margaret, raised me without ever demanding credit for it. Richard wasn't some cartoon villain. He was the kind of man who made every room adjust around him. She would say, "Just don't poke him right now," and I learned early that peace meant making myself small. When my mother and Richard lost their rental, the story was simple. Rent had gone up. They needed somewhere to land for a few weeks. My grandmother was already getting weaker by then, though none of us understood how fast it was happening. A few weeks became a month. Then 2. Then 6. Then my grandmother died. People kept saying, "At least she lived a long life," like that made losing her easier. She was 84. At the lawyer's office, I sat beside my mother in a black dress. Richard sat on her other side. Daniel, the lawyer, read through the will in a calm voice. My grandmother left my mother a small savings account and some jewelry. A few sentimental things were divided up. Then Daniel said the house was mine. Not split between us. Not left to my mother. Mine. My mother made a sound like the air had been knocked out of her. Richard leaned back and said, "That can't be right." Daniel looked down at the document again, even though he already knew what it said. "Margaret updated this will several years ago. It is valid." Richard muttered, "Convenient." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I wasn't happy. I wasn't celebrating. I would have handed over the deed in a second if it meant hearing my grandmother humming in that kitchen again. But that's not how death works. Death takes the person and leaves paperwork behind, and everyone is forced to reveal who they really are while pretending they're just being practical. My mother cried in the parking lot. Not grief crying. Angry crying. She said, "I don't understand why she would do this to me." I wanted to say, maybe because she knew you would let Richard take it. But I didn't. I hugged her because that's what I always did. She fell apart, and I became the stable one. After the funeral, I didn't ask them to leave. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I still had my apartment, and I knew finding a place in Portland was hard. I told my mother they could stay while they looked for something. I said we would talk about a timeline after things settled. That was my first mistake. The second was paying for everything without making the rules clear. The property taxes came due, and I paid them. Insurance had to be updated, and I paid that too. In January, the furnace went out, and my mother called crying because the house was freezing. Richard got on the phone and said he didn't have that kind of money just sitting around. So I paid for the repair. A few weeks later, Richard stepped through one of the back porch boards and complained that the house was falling apart. I paid to fix that too. Meanwhile, they paid no rent. Not even a small amount. They both worked, but every conversation about money became a story about gas prices, medical bills, old debts, groceries, and how impossible everything was. I knew things were expensive. I wasn't blind. But they were living in an entire house for free while I paid rent on my apartment and covered the house expenses on top of it. Finally, I suggested $600 a month. Not market rent. Not even close. Just something to help with taxes, insurance, and repairs. My mother looked at me like I had slapped her. She said, "Your grandmother would be ashamed of you charging your own mother." That sentence worked on me longer than I want to admit. I backed down. I told myself grief makes people unreasonable. I told myself my mother was embarrassed. I told myself family helps family. And the ugly truth is, I still wanted her to choose me. Even at 32, some stupid little part of me still wanted my mother to look at me and say, "I know this is hard for you too." She never did. The first time something really cracked in me was the chair. I went to the house one Saturday to pick up some of my grandmother's things. I had put it off because every room still felt too heavy, but I wanted her photo albums, recipe cards, and a few things from the sewing room before more time passed. When I walked into the living room, her chair was gone. It was an old cream-colored chair with wooden arms and a faded cushion. Nothing expensive. But it was where she sat every morning with tea and crossword puzzles. It was where she stitched buttons back onto my school shirts. It was where she sat the day I told her my engagement was over and I thought I had ruined my life. She had patted the arm of that chair and said, "Sit down, sweetheart. Ruined lives don't usually come with soup." I stood in the living room, staring at the empty corner. I asked my mother, "Where's Grandma's chair?" She barely looked up. "We donated it." I thought I heard her wrong. "You what?" "It smelled old, Jessica. And Richard said it was taking up space." For a second, I couldn't speak. My throat closed like my body was trying to stop me from saying something I couldn't take back. I said, "You donated her chair without asking me?" My mother sighed. "It's a chair. You can't keep everything like a museum." Then I went upstairs. My grandmother's sewing room was full of Richard's things. Toolboxes, plastic bins, dirty boots, hunting gear, and old tires. Tires. In the room where my grandmother used to organize fabric by color and keep a little jar of buttons she said had better manners than most people. I asked Richard to move his things out until I could go through the room properly. He said, "We live here. We're not going to tiptoe around dead people forever." That sentence did something to me. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I just looked at him and realized he had been waiting for my grandmother to stop being a person and become an obstacle. A week later, Barbara called me. She lived next door and had known my grandmother for decades. She spoke carefully, like she didn't want to start a fight but couldn't stay quiet. She said, "Jessica, I thought you should know Richard has been telling people he's working on buying the house from family." My stomach dropped. I asked, "Buying it from who?" There was a pause. Barbara said, "That's what worried me." Then she told me Richard had been talking about tearing down the back porch, expanding the garage, and maybe cutting down the apple tree because the yard would be easier to manage without it. The apple tree. The same tree my grandmother used to stand under with a basket in one hand, telling me not to pick the bruised apples because those were for pies. The same tree she refused to cut down even when the roots cracked part of the walkway because, in her words, not every old thing needs to be removed just because it gets inconvenient. I called my mother immediately. She got defensive before I finished the question. She said they were just thinking ahead. She said the house made more sense for them because I was single and could live anywhere. She said Richard had ideas to improve the property. I asked, "Were you planning to buy it from me?" She said, "Well, not at market value. We're family." I asked what she thought was fair. She said maybe $40,000, paid over time. The house had been appraised at $310,000. I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because if I didn't laugh, I was going to scream. I said, "Mom, that's not buying the house. That's taking it." She said, "You're becoming cold." Then Richard took the phone from her. He said, "You didn't earn that house. You got lucky because an old woman played favorites." I remember standing in my apartment kitchen, holding the phone so tightly my fingers hurt. He said, if she had been thinking clearly, she would have left it to her daughter. Maybe that is where people get divided. Because yes, my mother was her daughter. I understand how painful it must be to be skipped over. I'm not pretending that wouldn't hurt. But my grandmother was thinking clearly. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew my mother loved Richard more loudly than she protected anything else. She knew that if my mother got that house, Richard would own it in every way that mattered. After that call, I contacted Daniel. I didn't tell my mother. I needed to know my rights before guilt talked me out of protecting myself again. Daniel explained that because there was no lease and they were living there with permission, I could give proper written notice under state rules. He helped me draft it. 60 days to leave. I stared at that notice for 2 nights. I kept imagining my mother's face. I kept hearing her say I was choosing property over family. I kept wondering if I was becoming the kind of person I hated, the kind of person who used legal papers when conversations got hard. Then Barbara called again. This time, her voice was tight. She said, "There's a dumpster in the driveway." I drove there so fast I barely remember the trip. When I pulled up, there it was. A big metal dumpster sitting beside the garage. My grandmother's house looked smaller behind it, like even the house was ashamed. I got out and saw black trash bags piled inside. Cardboard boxes from the attic. A cracked lamp I recognized from the guest room. Christmas garland. Old picture frames. Then I saw one of the photo albums. It was sitting on top of a trash bag, half open, the plastic page curled from the damp air. A picture of my grandmother holding me as a baby was visible through the sleeve. I climbed onto the edge of the dumpster without thinking. My mother came out onto the porch and said, "Jessica, stop. You're making a scene." I held up the album and said, "Why is this in the trash?" She looked uncomfortable for half a second, then hardened. "We were cleaning. A lot of it is just old junk." Old junk. That was when Richard appeared in the doorway. He didn't even look guilty. He leaned against the frame and said, "If you wanted all this crap, you should have collected it sooner." Something in me went quiet. Not calm. Not peaceful. Just quiet. Like the last soft part of me stepped back and let another version take over. I climbed down with the album against my chest, walked to my car, pulled the eviction notice from my bag, and went back to the porch. My mother saw the paper and immediately started shaking her head. I handed it to her. She read the first few lines and started crying. Richard snatched it from her, scanned it, and laughed once like he couldn't believe I had the nerve. He said, "You're evicting your own mother?" I said, "I'm asking you to leave my house." He said, "Same thing." Maybe it was. I still don't know. My mother said, "You're really choosing a house over me?" I looked at the dumpster. I looked at the photo album in my arms. I looked at Richard standing in my grandmother's doorway like he owned the grief too. I said, "No. I'm choosing the last thing Grandma gave me." That was the first time I didn't comfort her after making her cry. The next 60 days were awful. My Aunt Patricia called me selfish and said no decent daughter would make her mother scramble for housing. My cousin Sarah said I should sell the house and split the money because morally it belonged to my mother too. Richard posted vague things online about greedy younger generations and families being destroyed by money. My mother sent screenshots of rental listings with messages like, "This is what you're forcing us into." I almost caved twice. The first time was when my mother left a voicemail crying so hard I could barely understand her. She said Richard was furious, she was exhausted, and she didn't know how everything had gone so wrong between us. I sat on my bathroom floor listening to it with my hand over my mouth. The second time was when Patricia said, "Your grandmother would hate seeing the family like this." That one hurt. Because maybe she would. My grandmother hated conflict. She hated raised voices. She hated scenes. But she also hated people taking things that weren't theirs and calling it need. I called Daniel again and asked if I was doing the right thing. He didn't answer like a friend. He answered like a lawyer. He said, "You are protecting your property." It sounded cold, but maybe I needed cold. A few days later, Nancy came over. She was my best friend, the kind of person who shows up with coffee and doesn't ask you to explain your face. I told her everything. The chair, the dumpster, the $40,000 offer, all of it. She asked me one question. "Would your grandmother have wanted Richard to have that house?" I said no. She said, "Then stop pretending this is confusing." They left on day 58. No apology. No final conversation. My mother texted that the keys were on the counter and that she hoped I was happy in my empty house. I drove there after work with Nancy behind me in her car. I don't know why, but I was scared. Not that Richard would be there. I was scared of what I would feel when I walked in and nobody else was inside. The house was dirty, but not destroyed. The kitchen floor was sticky. The yard was overgrown. Richard had left deep scratches on the garage wall. The downstairs bedroom smelled like old takeout and dust. It could have been worse. I changed the locks that same day. Then I stood in the living room and cried because the corner where my grandmother's chair used to sit was still empty. For the next week, Nancy helped me clean. We pulled trash bags from closets, scrubbed counters, opened windows, and sorted through what was left. Some things were gone forever. Some things I managed to save from the dumpster. The photo albums smelled damp, but most of the pictures were okay. I found a box of Christmas ornaments under a tarp in the garage. 3 were broken. I kept the pieces anyway. Then we found the recipe cards. They had slipped behind a shelf in the kitchen, tied together with a blue ribbon. My grandmother's handwriting was all over them. Apple pie, lemon cookies, chicken soup. Little notes in the margins like, "Jessica likes extra cinnamon," and "Linda says too salty, ignore her." I laughed so suddenly it turned into a sob. While cleaning the drawers, Nancy found a taped envelope underneath the old silverware tray. My name was written on it. Jessica. My hands started shaking before I even opened it. Inside was a short note in my grandmother's handwriting. Uneven and shaky, like she had written it when she was already weak. She wrote that she knew the house might become a storm. She wrote that she loved my mother, but love did not mean pretending not to see the truth. She wrote that I had spent too much of my life making room for other people's chaos. Then the last line said, "I want you to have one place nobody can take from you." I sat on the kitchen floor and broke. Not pretty crying. Not movie crying. The kind where your whole body folds and you make sounds you hope nobody remembers. Nancy sat beside me and didn't say anything. She just put her hand on my back and let me fall apart. That note changed something in me. Before that, I still wondered if I had misunderstood my grandmother's wishes. If maybe she had left me the house impulsively. If maybe she had made a mistake. But she hadn't. She knew. She saw the storm before I was brave enough to name it. My mother and Richard found a small 2-bedroom rental across town. From what Patricia tells me, Richard hates it. He says they were robbed. He says the house was supposed to be their fresh start. He says I let a dead woman turn me against my own mother. My mother and I barely speak. She sent one text after I moved in. I hope it was worth it. I stared at that message for a long time. I wanted to write back something sharp. I wanted to say, was the chair worth it, or were the photo albums worth throwing away, or was Richard's garage worth losing your daughter? But I didn't. I just wrote, "I hope you're okay." She didn't answer. I live in the house now. It is still too quiet sometimes. The pipes knock at night. The porch needs more work. The apple tree drops fruit all over the yard, and I understand now why my grandmother complained about it every fall while refusing to cut it down. I painted the sewing room, but I kept one wall the same soft green she chose years ago. I put her recipe cards in a box by the stove. And the chair is back. I found it at the thrift store my mother donated it to. $12. $12 for the chair my grandmother sat in every morning. $12 for the place she drank tea, worked crossword puzzles, and made me feel like a child worth keeping. I bought it back and put it in the living room corner. Now every morning before work, I sit there with coffee or tea, depending on how much sleep I got. Sometimes I feel peaceful. Sometimes I feel guilty. Sometimes both at once. That is the part people don't understand about boundaries. They don't always feel powerful. Sometimes they feel like grief with a lock on the door. I didn't win exactly. My grandmother is still gone. My mother still thinks I betrayed her. Richard still gets to call himself the victim to anyone willing to listen. Part of my family still believes I should have sacrificed the house to keep the peace. But for the first time in my life, I have a place where nobody is yelling from the other room. Nobody is moving my memories into a dumpster. Nobody is telling me love means handing over the only solid thing I have ever been given. Maybe that makes me selfish. Maybe a better daughter would have waited longer, charged less, forgiven more, and kept swallowing disrespect until it looked like kindness. But my grandmother spent years giving me shelter from the chaos my mother kept choosing. The last thing she gave me was the right to stop letting that chaos move in with me. So was I wrong for giving my mother and stepdad 60 days to leave the house I inherited, even though they said they had nowhere better to go?